Hello students, welcome to our latest update program. My name is Saloni Nandkyoliar, and in this session let us talk about India's GDP growth rate because the data for Q2 is out and the growth rate is quite high. So let's critically analyze the reasons behind this increase along with any caveats that we must be aware of. So let's begin. The Ministry of Statistics and Program Implementation has released this data, and the data says that the GDP growth rate for Q2 this year is 8.2%. The GDP growth rate. And this is calculated on an year-on-year basis and at constant prices, which means that if you compare this data with last year's Q2, the increase is 8.2%, and this is the GDP growth rate. Which GDP growth rate? The real GDP growth rate. I am not talking about the nominal GDP growth rate here. 8.2% is the real GDP growth rate, which has been adjusted for inflation. This graph over here tells us the quarterly GDP growth rate for all these past years, and this year's Q2 data is 8.2%. So there are going to be some reasons, some drivers behind this increase. So let's look at those drivers. So some sectors basically performed really well that contributed to this increase in the growth rate. Can you guess those sectors? First is the services sector. Services sector grew at 9.2%. Exceptionally strong. Services sector, the banking, IT, consulting, finances, they grew at a very high rate of 9.2%. In fact, if we talk about a subsector over here, which is the financial and professional services sector, this alone grew at 10.2%. Exceptionally strong. This grew at 10.2%. So our services sector did really well. That is why our GDP increased. Then the manufacturing sector. Okay, the manufacturing sector also did quite well. This grew at 9.1%. Manufacturing sector grew at 9.1%, which means that we manufactured more, we produced more. But there is a caveat. So whenever you look at any data, it becomes extremely important to critically analyze that data so as to understand the complete picture. This manufacturing sector grew at 9.1%, partly because A, we produced more, which is the right way to grow. You produce more, you manufacture more. But B, this was merely numerical, partly numerical or statistical in nature because of the low base effect. Now, what is this low base effect? I told you this is being calculated on an year-on-year basis. So when our base is low, the thing that we're comparing it from, when the base is low, then the growth automatically is going to look higher. For example, let's say there are two scenarios. Okay, last year we produced 100 units. Last year we produced 100 units and this year we produced 109 units. So production wise, there is an increase of 9 units. But if you calculate this in percentage, this becomes 9%. An increase of 9 units is going to give you a percentage increase of 9% because the base here is low. If you increase this base in scenario 2, 200 units. Last year, the manufacturing sector did exceptionally well. We produced 200 units. But this year also, the increase was only of 9 units. The increase this year was not exceptionally high. Again, only 9 units. We produced 209 units. And in percentage now, this is going to be how much? 4.5% only. Same increase of 9 units is going to give you different percentage results because the base is different. When the base is low, even if there is not an exceptional increase in this year's manufacturing, it is still going to appear high. Numerically, it is going to appear high because of the low base effect. So the manufacturing sector grew partly because we produced more, but partly because of the low base effect also. So this is something that we need to watch out for. And then our construction sector. The construction sector also did well. It grew at 7.2%. This is a good thing. We constructed more highways, more roadways, more transport, etc. But here also, government did most of the heavy lifting. The capital expenditure, government development, infrastructure development from government was more. The private sector investment was not so much. Private sector construction was not so much. So the employment opportunities are going to be restricted if the private sector does not contribute to this. So this again is something that we need to be mindful of. But overall, the construction sector grew by 7.2%. And then our agriculture sector also grew by 3.5%. Not significant, but still positive. So basically all these sectors grew and that led to an increase in our GDP growth. So these were the driving factors. But some things that we need to be careful of. One, I already told you, there is a low base effect that we saw in the manufacturing sector. Next, I told you, this is the real GDP growth rate. The real GDP growth rate is adjusted for inflation. So if our deflator, the price deflator is going to be very low, or let's say the inflation is going to be very low, the real GDP automatically is going to be very high. Because what is real GDP? Real GDP is equal to nominal GDP by the price deflator. It's purely statistical in nature. If the inflation is very low, and that was the case for the quarter also, when the inflation is very low, real GDP is automatically going to be very high, even if the nominal GDP is not as high. The prices have not increased, but only because the inflation is very low, the deflator here is that in this scenario, that is why we say that the real GDP is significantly high. And you might be thinking, if the inflation is low, if the inflation is very low, that's a great thing, right? Okay, so it's a good thing for the households. It's good for the households, it's good for the citizens, for people like you and me, but it is not so good for the government. Because government basically depends on nominal GDP for its tax collections. This depends on the nominal GDP. So if the prices, let's say, the prices have not increased as much, so the nominal GDP has not increased as much because the inflation was low, that is why our real GDP is very high. But if the nominal GDP is not increased as much, which means the GST collections for the government again have not increased as much. And when the GST collections or any other collections of that form have not increased, how is the government going to generate its revenue? Government's revenue generation majorly depends on the nominal GDP. That again depends upon inflation. So if the inflation is very low, it's a good thing for the households, but it is not such a good thing for the government. And if all this happens, if the tax collections, if the collection for the government goes down, then the fiscal burden for the government goes up, because government is going to use the revenue from these collections to fulfill the fiscal burden gap, to fulfill the fiscal deficit. If it's not getting money from here, the fiscal deficit is going to increase. And right now, to maintain a fiscal deficit of 4.4%, we need a nominal GDP growth rate of some 10%. We need a nominal GDP growth rate of 10%, and what we have at the moment is 8.7%. The real GDP growth rate is 8.2% and the nominal GDP growth rate is 8.7% only, versus the government requires at least 10%, at least this to be 10%, so that it can maintain its fiscal deficit targets. So it's not such a good thing for government because the collections are going to go down, and that is also something that we need to be careful of, that all these things might just be numerical or statistical in nature. So our GDP growth rate has increased, partly because the consumption has also increased, the production has also increased, the manufacturing has also increased, but partly this is also purely numerical in nature, purely statistical in nature. And very recently the IMF also had given us a ranking, and the ranking was very poor actually. It was C. We received a C rank from IMF, which basically tells us that we need to make significant improvements in our GDP calculation, in our GDP growth. The data is also skewed at the moment. So we have to look at all these things, and the GDP growth should actually be holistic in nature. It should not depend on numerical things or statistical things. It should be more balanced. And right now, that balance is kind of missing. So while these sectors are doing good, services definitely is doing exceptionally good, but while the other sectors, they are doing good, but in some of the sectors, government alone is doing the heavy lifting, and that is not a great sign for the growth rate of GDP or for the growth rate of any country. That is why we need to have a more balanced approach in this entire thing. So that was all for this video. I hope you were able to understand what are the major factors that have led to this increase and what are some things that we need to be careful of. Now let us look at a practice question for prelims. With reference to India's recent GDP growth performance, consider the following statements. 1. A low GDP deflator can raise real GDP growth even when nominal GDP growth is modest. 2. Construction sector growth in India is driven mainly by public capital expenditure rather than private industrial investment. 3. A low base effect can exaggerate year-on-year growth rates in sectors like manufacturing. 4. Higher inflation usually increases real GDP growth by raising the value of goods and services produced. Please read all the statements carefully. There are some terms over here. Please read all of them carefully. And then how many of the statements given above is or are correct? A, only 1, B, only 2, C, only 3, or D, all 4. Attempt this question and provide your answers in the comment section. And if there's a lot of confusion, we'll pin the correct answer. Thank you for watching.
For more informative content, like, share and subscribe. And do not forget to press the bell icon to get the notifications.